Are you interested in discovering the spiritual and theological mysteries of the Old Testament, as well as exploring the current historical and archaeological evidence that supports or confounds the biblical narrative? If so, prepare to have your eyes opened as we journey to Damascus. Hello there, and welcome to St. James's Journey to Damascus. Last week's video, we left off. I was trying to get all the way to the end of 2 Samuel. We were so close. The last chapter or two was all that was left, and we just couldn't quite fit it in. So today we are going to wrap up the last two chapters of 2 Samuel and then just get ourselves started into the first book of Kings. And I'm going to try to push ourselves through that, and then maybe in the next video we'll look at a little bit more of an overview of the book of Kings, first and second, and give you a little, understanding of where the story is going to go in the long run before we start working our way through it. But today we're going to finish up the last couple of chapters of 2 Samuel. As you know, David is getting on in years. The 23rd chapter of 2 Samuel is actually got a title to it, which is a little unusual because most of the books of the Bible do not have titles from the time they were written. This one is called David's Last Words. And that gives us a little clue that David is getting near the end of his reign here. It almost reads a bit like, I don't want to say a will, but it is certainly a testament where David speaks to God and thanks God for all of the blessings God has poured out on him and his family. And then he goes into talking about some of the men that helped him get to where he was king and were faithful to him all of his years, both when they were back hiding out in caves, right up through the time that they were battling Philistines and conquering Israel's enemies. And in doing so, David speaks of the mighty men of David and a group of men called the 30, which is a little ironic because there's 37 of them. However, they are known as the 30, and within the 30 is a group of men known as the Three. And these were all the most famous, well-known warriors of Israel, and these were all the most loyal men to David all of his years, from the time he was hiding out from Saul, like I said, right up until his dynasty. David starts to talk about who these men are. He says, of the 30, there is the leader, who is their captain, a name of somebody we've all heard of from several of these videos already. It is Abishai. Abishai, the one who rescued David from death, is the captain of the 30. And it says that he is as famous as the Three, but he's not one of the Three. Apparently being one of the Three was a really big thing. We learn that Abishai had many great battles that he was in. He was a great leader, a great warrior. He once killed 300 Philistines in one battle with his spear. And he was David's most loyal and his greatest general that he ever had amongst his ranks. He killed the giant Philistine that was trying to kill David, almost killed David. It was another one of his great feats. After Abishai, we're told about Benaiah. Benaiah once killed 2 Moabite champions, and on a snowy day, we're told, he chased a lion into a pit, which he then killed with his bare hands. On another occasion, he fought an Egyptian with nothing more than a club in his hand and took the Egyptian's spear from him and killed him with his own spear. It was another one of the great stories of Benaiah. We're told also he was as famous as the Three, but he was not one of the Three. Now we get to the actual Three. Benaiah was also known as being the head of David's personal bodyguards, which was a great honor. So of the three, the great three was Joshabim. Joshabim was the leader of the three. We're told he once killed 800 men in a single battle with his spear. Next is Eliezer. Eliezer was a longtime warrior of David, went back to the days when David was just hiding out in caves with a few men. He killed Philistines in battle until he was so tired he couldn't lift his sword any longer. And he had many other great victories. And then there was Shammah. Shammah was a great warrior who once beat back a contingency of Philistines, a small army, and he did it single-handedly out in a field, all standing alone. Once when David and his men were in their stronghold, we're told this story about the three. David and his men are in a stronghold. There's a Philistine contingency in the city of Bethlehem. David mentions to the three, just in passing, that Bethlehem has one of the best wells in all of Israel. That there's a well just outside the gates of Bethlehem that has the sweetest water in Israel. Well, the three take it upon themselves, Joshabim, Eliezer, and Shammah, take it upon themselves to go down into Bethlehem, fight their way through to the well, draw some water out for David, and fight their way back out and bring it back to David. We have a woodcut of that incident here. They bring the water back to David, who realizes what these men went through to get it. They're probably cut up and exhausted and dirty from fighting their ways in and out. And David refuses to drink the water. He says that he will not drink of water that was bought with the blood of his men. So he pours the water out onto the ground and offers it as an offering to God for the bravery of his men and their loyalty and what they've done for him. So interesting story. So that's the 30 and the 3 that David mentions in this particular chapter. Which brings us to chapter 24, the last chapter of 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 24 starts off a little strange. We are told that the Lord is angry with the people of Israel, so he causes David to hold a census of the people of Israel. So David asks Joab, I believe it is, Joab and one of the other commanders of the army, to take a census of all the tribes of Israel. So they head out and they travel from Dan in the north to Bathsheba in the south, and they number all of the warriors, all the men of Israel who are able to carry a sword and go to war. It takes them 9 months and 20 days before they return to Jerusalem, and they report to David that there are 800,000 capable soldiers in all the land of Israel, and another 500,000 capable soldiers in Judah. Then David, whose, we're told, conscience is bothering him, said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly by taking a census. Now, we don't really know why David considered this to be a sinful thing to do. There's a lot of theories out there. None of them really make a lot of sense. One I read I thought was kind of interesting, that perhaps David felt in his heart that he was asking them to number these men so that he could boast or feel grand about the number of warriors that he had loyal to him in his nation. But it doesn't really explain it. And it seems kind of like a little bit of an odd thing for him to feel terribly guilty about. He turns to God and says that he has sinned indeed by having this census. Remember, it was God who put it in David's mind to hold the census in the first place. And the Lord tells him, the Lord actually then turns and tells the prophet Gad to go to David and say this: the Lord told me to tell you to choose a punishment which is hidden behind one of three doors. Door number 1, door number 2, and door number 3. Actually, I'm kidding, he didn't say that. There are no doors. But the Lord does tell him that he has to pick his own punishment, which is really just as strange altogether. Punishment number 1 he can choose: 3 years of famine throughout all the land. All these choices have 3s. 3 years of famine throughout the land, choice number 1. Choice number 2, 3 months of fleeing from your enemies. Choice number 3, 3 days of severe plague throughout the land. Well, none of those seem like very good choices, frankly. But you know, I'm going to tell you, I was thinking about these myself. I couldn't help but think, which of these would I choose? Well, in looking them over, I thought, 3 years of famine, that's a long time. I don't think I could pick that one. And frankly, the last one, 3 days of severe plague, I don't think I'd like that one either. And though I wouldn't like any of them, I thought 3 months of fleeing from your enemies was the least of them. I thought that's the one that I would probably choose. However, that's not the one David chooses. His rationale is 3 months of fleeing from your enemies is contingent upon men. How your men react to running, how those men react to chasing you down. The first one too, 3 years of famine throughout the land. I guess he figured there was still a level of some of the coming out of that being about farming. Anyways, he mentions these were of men. He chose the last one, 3 days of famine, deciding that, or of plagues rather, 3 days of plague. He decided that that was completely only based in God's punishment, and that God was merciful, and so no doubt that would be the least of the 3. So that's the one that David chooses. So David chooses that punishment, and the plague indeed does strike Israel for 3 days, and we are told that over 70,000 people die in the plague. But as the angel of death was preparing to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord relented and said to the angel, "Stop, that is enough." At that moment, the angel of death was at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite, where David happened to be standing. So, David said to the angel, "I am the one who sinned, but these people are innocent sheep. Don't take this out on them. Take this out on me. It would be better that I and my family suffer for this than these innocent people." About that time, Gad showed up again, the prophet, and told David that he should build an altar to God and sacrifice burnt and peace offerings on it. He should do it right here on the threshing floor where David saw the angel. So David goes to Araunah and asks him if he can buy his threshing floor that he might build an altar there and do sacrifices to God to end the plague. And Araunah tells him, "Lord, you do whatever you think is right. You need my threshing floor, you take it. In fact, I think I will provide you the oxen, and you can tear up the floor for your fire and do the burnt offering, and I will just donate all these things if you think that this is going to stop the plague in Israel." Well, David appreciates that, but tells Araunah that he cannot just take these things, that he will not hold a sacrifice to God that he did not pay for. So he ends up paying 50 pieces of silver, and they tear up the floor, and they build a big wooden fire, and they do burnt offerings of oxen and other animals and peace offerings, and they offer these up to God to stop the plague, which, I don't know, maybe he didn't realize God had already told the angel to stop the plague. But that's the way 2 Samuel ends. Kind of a little bit of a strange ending to the whole thing, but then again, many of the stories in 2 Samuel were a little odd. But it was a good book. I really appreciate all the stories that are in there, all the people. That's part of what I really like about these Old Testament stories. The people are just so regular. I know that the situations they're in are far removed from anything we deal with, but yet the stories make these people seem like very regular people trying to deal with these extraordinary times. That brings us to 1 Kings, part 1. Of course, 1 Kings and 2 Kings, just like 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, are really one book, but one very long book with a lot of stories. So the writers decided to break these books up. So 1 Kings is where we're going into next. We're told right off the bat that David is now of a very old age, and his son Adonijah sought to be the next king of Israel. He solicited Joab, who you remember was one of the generals of David, and he also got the priest Abiathar to help him become king, to which they agreed they would do. However, many refused to follow because they knew that David had already promised that Solomon, his son Solomon, would actually be the heir to his throne. So the priest Zadok and Benaniah, you remember, one of the 30, the great warrior, and Nathan, the prophet, who talked to David about his infidelity with Bathsheba, all decide, and David's personal bodyguard, all are with David and will not join in with Adonijah. So Adonijah went to a place called Zoheleth to make sacrifices, and there he invited all of his brothers, all of David's sons, to come there, to join him, to be a part of his rally to be the next king of Israel, of which they all came, but he did not invite Solomon or Zadok or Benaniah or Nathan or any of the personal bodyguards of David. And somebody then comes to Bathsheba and makes her aware of the fact that Adonijah is preparing to set himself up, that he's blown the ram's horn and they are celebrating, and that he is setting himself up to be the next king of Israel. Well, of course, Solomon is Bathsheba's son, so she certainly has an interest in this. So she goes to David and tells him what Adonijah is doing. It says, "Do you not know that Adonijah has all these people, followers with him, and that he is preparing to throw a coup and become the next king of Israel? Did you not promise that to my son and your son Solomon?" David said, "Absolutely." He said, "Solomon will be the next king if I have anything to do with it." So Nathan comes in and also confirms with David the same thing Bathsheba had told him about Adonijah. So David tells Nathan that he should take Solomon and he should take Zadok and he should take him down to the spring at Gihon and anoint him king over Israel with oils and blow the ram's horn and shout, "Long live King Solomon." Then escort him back here to Jerusalem, where I will give him my blessing and have him seated on my throne as a sign to all the people that this is who I ordain to be the next king of Israel. So Nathan and the elders did as David told them, and they anointed Solomon, and the people of Jerusalem see what's going on and join in the celebration. And after being anointed and declared king, people start playing flutes and clanging cymbals and dancing along and following Solomon back into Jerusalem. It's a big celebration. Now, from where Adonijah was sacrificing with his folks, everyone could hear the ram's horn blast and this celebration coming back into Jerusalem. And so they don't know, they're asking, what is it that's going on in Jerusalem? What's happening down there? Just at that time, Jonathan, who was Abiathar's son, arrived to tell Adonijah that David had just declared Solomon to be king, and Solomon was sitting on the royal throne. Well, immediately, all of Adonijah's followers head for the hills in fear of what David's going to say when they find out that they're backing Adonijah and he has just anointed Solomon. And it's not mentioned, but I'm sure there was more to it than that there was plotting involved and there was basically planning an overthrow. But before they could, all this comes down, and now they're scared of what David will do, and so they all run for the hills and leave Adonijah alone. Adonijah, of course, is scared to death. He goes to the temple, which, if you remember, is the tabernacle, and goes to the tabernacle, and there he grabs onto the horns of the altar in fear because he's sure that nothing will happen. They won't do anything to him there, and he is afraid that David, or Solomon even, will now come for his life. So, when Solomon heard this, that Adonijah was hiding out in the tabernacle, he said as long as Adonijah was loyal to him, that Adonijah would be perfectly safe. But if he made any trouble, he would certainly die. So Solomon summoned Adonijah to come to him, and Adonijah does, and he bows down very respectfully. We're not told of a conversation, but I'm sure some kind of conversation takes place. Solomon is convinced that Adonijah will support him and is no longer a threat, and he dismisses him to go home. This brings us to the second chapter in 1 Kings, and it's David, whose death is drawing very near now. He says to Solomon, I will be dying soon. Take courage and be a man. Observe the requirements of the Lord God. Keep the decrees, commands, regulations, and the laws written by Moses, so you will be successful in all that you do. If you do this, the Lord will keep the promise that one of my descendants will always sit on the throne. Then David said, this is kind of interesting, Joab murdered 2 army commanders, Abner and Amasa, pretending it was an act of war, but it was not. It was a time of peace. And now he has stained himself and my family with innocent blood. Do with him as you wish, but don't let him grow old and die in peace. Also on his way out, David has not forgotten Shimei. You remember Shimei? When David was running from Jerusalem from Absalom, Shimei was the one who was walking parallel along the hill, cursing David and his men the whole way. When David came back to Jerusalem in victory, Shimei came out and apologized and did all this stuff, bowed down to him, and David promised that he would not kill him. However, he didn't promise anything about his descendants. So he goes on to say to Solomon, oh yeah, and one more thing. Remember Shimei, the man who cursed me when I was fleeing from Jerusalem from Absalom? Well, I swore not to harm him, but that doesn't make him innocent. You are a wise man, and I know somehow you will arrange a bloody death for him. Then David dies. Apparently he figures that was the last of the business that he needed to wrap up before he passed away. David dies and is buried with his ancestors in the city of David. All in all, David reigned for 40 years. Something I thought was kind of interesting about this, David was a great king. And to this day, of the Jewish faith, he is known as one of the greatest that ever lived. And in many of our previous chapters of the Bible, when Abraham died, or Moses died, or Joshua died, we're told that the whole kingdom mourned for several days, and that this was a great sad event, but not a mention of that with David's death. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I just think it's kind of odd that we don't hear of any of that from the author. He just says David reigned 40 years, and Solomon became king and sat in David's throne, and his kingdom was firmly established. Moving on. So one day we are told Adonijah came to Bathsheba in peace and asked her if she would ask King Solomon to let him marry Abishag. Abishag was the beautiful girl who had been taking care of King David in his old age, though we are told that David never had any kind of relations with her. Bathsheba agreed to ask her son. But when Bathsheba asked Solomon to let Adonijah marry Abishag, Solomon absolutely refuses and vowed that Adonijah has now sealed his fate with this request. Adonijah, Solomon's older brother, was then put to death by Solomon. You know, there's more happening here than him asking for Abishag's hand in marriage. Solomon, I think, saw how David was challenged time and again by some of his siblings, and this is probably a very tumultuous time in Israel where David, their great leader of 40 years, has now died, and there's a lot of uncertainty about Solomon's reign. So Solomon, I think, at this point is showing a firm hand in seeing that he dispatches anybody who is an enemy of his that he thinks may try to take some kind of claim over the throne. So he has Adonijah killed, and he tells Abiathar, the priest who supported Adonijah, to go home, and that he was lucky that Solomon doesn't kill him too. When Joab heard all that had happened, he went to the sacred tent, just as Adonijah had in fear, assuming he would not be killed while he was in the tabernacle. And Solomon sent Benaiah, his great warrior, to go up to the temple, to the tabernacle, and if Joab refused to come out, to go ahead and go into the tabernacle and kill Joab there and bury him right next to the altar on the spot. So Solomon sent Benaiah to kill Joab, to remove the guilt of Joab's senseless murders and to remove that guilt from David's family. Then Solomon appointed Benaiah the commander of the army in place of Joab, and Zadok chief priest instead of Abiathar. After that, he sent for Shimei and told him to build for himself a house in Jerusalem and live there, but not to step outside of the city. For if he ever left the city, Solomon would have him killed, and his death would be on his own hands, because he understands the situation he's in, and Shimei had said that this was fair enough. If you don't kill me, I'll stay in the city. But after 3 years, we're told that some of Shimei's servants had escaped and left him and run off, and he leaves the city to go find them and comes back. Solomon finds out that Shimei had left the city, and he directs Benaiah to take Shimei and kill him, which he did. And then we finish up the chapter by saying, now the kingdom was firmly in Solomon's grip. So that is our lesson for today. We got a little bit into 1 Kings, but I'm going to stop a little bit on our next one and kind of do a little bit of an overview. As you can see, this first part of Kings is kind of frankly, a little bit of the end of the story of 2 Samuel. Would have made just as much sense for these last 2 chapters to have been in 2 Samuel and be in 1 Kings. We will move on from there. Whew. That was a long ways coming through 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel. I feel like I've been there forever. Glad to be moving on to a new book. Lots of new stories, some great stories of the kings of Israel coming up. I hope you will continue to join us on our journey to Damascus. Thank you for tuning in on our video today, and look forward to having you with us again next time. Thank you. We hope you have enjoyed our discoveries for today. Please join us next time as we explore the insights of the Old Testament on the journey to Damascus.